In the last lecture, we talked about how uh, neurons generate action potentials. After an action potential is finished, every single region of the axon would be at positive 30. All right. Every single region would be at positive 30. That's really problematic. And let's see if you can figure out why. This neuron here, we don't know exactly where it's located, but every single neuron in your body can at least generate a couple hundred action potentials per second, and they often do. And then there are some neurons that can generate thousands of action potentials per second. I know that's incomprehensible to the human brain, which is ironically made up of neurons, that they would be capable of doing this, but they can. We know this for a fact. And the fact that every region of the axon is positive 30 presents a real problem. Because if this neuron can generate, let's say, 500 action potentials a second, and that's what it wants to do right now. It wants to generate 500 action potentials per second. And every single region is at positive 30 within the axon. Do you think that this neuron can generate another action potential? Well, of course not. Because what does an action potential involve? It involves getting the axon hillock to negative 55 millivolts from negative 70, right, depolarizing it. Then that opens voltage-gated sodium channels. Then the interior gets to positive 30. And then the sodium ions move to the next region, which needs to be negative 70. Then it gets that region more positive. Then the voltage-gated sodium channels open up in that region. And then that region becomes positive 30. And then it goes on to the next region. So the point is, if you want another action potential to occur, what does the neuron need to do? It needs to get every single one of these regions of the axon very quickly back to negative 70 millivolts. As soon as these regions hit positive 30 during an action potential, they very quickly need to return to negative 70 so that another action potential can happen. And this process of getting to positive 30 and then returning to negative 70 is called repolarizing. And that's what we're going to look at mostly in this lecture. So to begin this process, we need to go back to the axon hillock. Okay. And we need to discuss those voltage-gated sodium channels a little bit more closely than we did in the last lecture. Okay. First of all, these decremental waves of electricity called graded potentials are going to be headed towards the hillock from the dendritic regions. And they're trying to get the hillock from negative 70 to negative 55. And let's say that they do that. You know that the voltage-gated sodium channels open. But what I didn't tell you is the voltage-gated sodium channels actually have multiple different types of gates. And what happens when the interior of the hillock gets to negative 55, when it depolarizes by 15 millivolts, is these things called activation gates on the voltage-gated sodium channels open. So here is a voltage-gated sodium channel located in the membrane of the hillock. And right now, we can say the interior is negative 70 millivolts and it's closed. The resting membrane potential is at negative 70, and the voltage-gated sodium channels are shut, which means no sodium can come in. But look at what specifically is closed. What's closed on the voltage-gated sodium channels are what's called their activation gates. Okay. I've told you that the voltage-gated sodium channels are shut at negative 70, but I haven't told you what specifically is closed. And what specifically is closed on them is this activation gate. That's what's shut. This whole thing right here is going to be, this whole slide is really just going to be kind of a memorization game, and we'll make more sense of it as the lecture goes. So you're just going to kind of have to stick with me here. The activation gate is shut at negative 70 millivolts. Now, if you can depolarize the neuron by 15 millivolts and make the interior negative 55, you know what happens, I hope. The voltage-gated sodium channels open, right? And then that allows sodium, right? The hillock region becomes very, very permeable to sodium. The only sodium that's entering in at -70 is through the leak channels, right? So very little sodium is coming in. But if we get to -55 millivolts, now all of a sudden, the voltage-gated sodium channels open. The Hillock region becomes very, very permeable to sodium due to the opening of all these channels, and sodium shoots in. But what specifically opens at -55? When you get to -55 millivolts, what opens on the voltage-gated sodium channels are their activation gates. Their activation gates are what open, and that is how the sodium ions get through them into the Hillock region and drive it up to positive 30 millivolts. And now another important question comes into play, which is, we know that at threshold, -55 millivolts in the Hillock region, the voltage-gated sodium channels open, specifically their activation gates open. That's what allows sodium to come in, and then the interior hits positive 30 millivolts. But why does it get stuck at positive 30? Positive 30 is not the equilibrium potential for sodium. The equilibrium potential for sodium is positive 60 millivolts. So in theory, more sodium should be able to enter into the Hillock and drive the interior up another 30 millivolts. But it doesn't. It actually, the membrane gets stuck at positive 30. And why is the question. And the biggest reason is the voltage-gated sodium channels close. And that prevents any more sodium from coming in. But what closes on the voltage-gated sodium channels? It's not the activation gate. The activation gate doesn't close at positive 30. What closes is this other gate called the inactivation gate. Again, I know that this is all you're doing is memorizing things right here. This whole thing should make no sense right now. It will as the lecture progresses. So you just have to memorize this for the moment. The inactivation gate is what shuts, and that closing of the inactivation gate prevents any more sodium from being able to enter in through the voltage-gated sodium channels. And since no more sodium can enter in through these channels, that's the biggest reason you get stuck at positive 30. Because if you wanted the interior to keep becoming more positive, you would need sodium to keep entering. And it doesn't, because the voltage-gated sodium channels close at positive 30, specifically their inactivation gates. Before I move on, I want to show you another image of voltage-gated sodium channels from another textbook. This is how the voltage-gated sodium channels are drawn in another textbook, and you can see here's the activation gate and here's the inactivation gate. What you'll find is that different journal articles, different textbooks, different references, they just draw these gates and show these gates a little bit differently, but they all mean the exact same thing. The activation and the inactivation gate mean the same thing, but they might be depicted slightly differently in different references. So let's draw ourselves another picture of the Hillock. Right? Here are the voltage-gated sodium channels. And we'll do it like this. You drive the Hillock from -70 up to -55. And then you say, well, what happens at -55? Let's do this in green. What opens at -55 are the activation gates. And when the activation gates open, that allows for sodium to shoot in. The activation gates of the voltage-gated sodium channels, by the way, just to be clear, that allows for sodium to shoot in, and the interior hits positive 30. And then why does the interior get stuck at positive 30? Mostly because the inactivation gates, we'll draw them in red, on the voltage-gated sodium channels close. The inactivation gates shut, and that allows for no more sodium to enter, right? Sodium can't get in through these channels anymore, the voltage-gated sodium channels, because their inactivation gates close. And there's a second thing that also occurs here that's very important, and that is At positive 30, another type of voltage-gated channel opens. And this voltage-gated channel is called, I'm trying to draw that in a different color. How's that? That's a little bit better. Voltage-gated potassium channels. There are voltage-gated potassium channels located in the membrane of the hillock as well. And they're actually designed to open up at positive 30 millivolts. Now, what benefit would that have? Okay. What would the opening of voltage-gated potassium channels do? And you have to think about potassium ions. Potassium ions are high on the inside and they're low on the outside, right? They're high intracellularly and low extracellularly, or in the interstitial fluid. Okay, so they have a chemical driving force to leave. But what also do these potassium ions have right now? If we've made the interior of the cell, of the hillock, positive 30, then we've made the exterior actually negative to some degree, because the exterior has lost a whole bunch of sodium ions that came in, so the exterior has actually become slightly negative. The point I'm trying to make here is potassium actually at positive 30 has both a chemical driving force to leave, right? It always has that. It's a diffusion gradient to leave. But right now it actually also has an electrical driving force to leave because we've made the interior positive and the exterior slightly negative. So potassium really wants to shoot out of the cell. And if you open up these voltage-gated potassium channels, that's what's going to happen. These potassium ions are going to shoot out of the cell through both their chemical and their electrical driving force. And here's the next thing you have to think about. If potassium shoots out of the cell through both a chemical and an electrical driving force, the hillock region is hemorrhaging positively charged ions, right? It's losing positively charged potassium ions. What's that going to do to the interior, right? I think we've talked about this a lot. I hope this makes sense. If the interior starts losing a whole bunch of positively charged potassium ions, it's going to begin to become negative, right? Because it's a loss of positively charged ions, and comparatively, negatively charged ions will be rising. If a whole bunch of potassium ions are shooting out through these voltage-gated potassium channels, it's going to drive the interior back down towards negative 70 millivolts. So here is an image of the voltage-gated potassium channels. Okay, usually the voltage-gated potassium channels are shut. Okay, but let's say that we get to threshold. And what opens? At threshold, let's pretend that in black here is a voltage-gated sodium channel. If we get to threshold, then negative 55, by the way, then the activation gate on the voltage-gated sodium channel opens. Sodium shoots in, drives the interior up to positive 30. At positive 30, two things happen. Two things. One, the inactivation gates on the voltage-gated sodium channels shut. That allows for no more sodium to come in. Biggest reason you get stuck at positive 30. The second thing that happens, though, is the voltage-gated potassium channels open. You see this? The voltage-gated potassium channel opens up, right? To this image over here. The voltage-gated potassium channel opens. There's many of them. And now potassium leaves through both its chemical and its electrical, because the outside is slightly negative, driving force. Potassium shoots out, and the interior gets driven back down towards negative 70. I keep saying back down towards negative 70 because there's actually many things to say about this that I haven't said yet. I just want to make clear that what's called efflux of these potassium ions is what is going to start driving the membrane potential back down towards the resting membrane potential. Draw our axon hillock again. And finally discuss the very important reason that voltage-gated sodium channels have both activation and inactivation gates. All right, so let's just do this right now. Okay. The voltage-gated sodium channels, I'll draw them in red. inactivation gates are shut. Simultaneously, the voltage-gated potassium channels are open. Right? That's the two things that happen at positive 30. Right? When the interior hits positive 30, the inactivation gates on the voltage-gated sodium channels shut, and the voltage-gated potassium channels open. Potassium shoots out. Oops, that's bad. Shoots out and drives the interior back down towards negative 70. All right. Let's just say, I mean, this happens, right? If potassium is shooting out and it drives the interior back down, and let's say that it gets to negative 55 millivolts, what should technically happen at negative 55 millivolts? If potassium is shooting out through its chemical and its electrical driving force at negative 55, it's not going to have an electrical driving force to leave anymore, but it's still shooting out, and it drives the interior back down to negative 55 millivolts. Okay, this is, again, the way that we say this is when we go from positive to negative, we call it a repolarization. So what we would really be saying is the neuron, the axon hillock specifically, is repolarizing from positive 30 millivolts to negative 55. Okay? If we're using the right language, we are repolarizing back towards the resting membrane potential because we're going from positive towards negative. All right, so we are repolarizing right now. And when we repolarize, move from positive to negative, and we get back to negative 55, what should technically happen at negative 55? That's threshold. Shouldn't the voltage-gated sodium channels open again? And the answer is yeah, technically they should. If you repolarize back to threshold, which is negative 55, those voltage-gated sodium channels here should pop open again. And if they did, what would happen? Sodium would shoot in again, and the action potential would start right over again. You would just get a repetitive loop of action potentials if the voltage-gated sodium channel were to just open at negative 55 during repolarization every single time. And I think the best way I can explain this is pretending that the voltage-gated sodium channels only had an activation gate. Okay, let's first talk about why the voltage-gated sodium channels don't open at negative 55. The reason that the voltage-gated sodium channels don't open at negative 55 during repolarization is because the inactivation gates in red are the ones that are closed. And those inactivation gates don't open up under a voltage. So when you get to negative 55 during repolarization, the interior can keep becoming more negative without the voltage-gated sodium channels opening. You can repolarize right back towards negative 70 millivolts. Something else is going to happen in between that, as we're going to see. But the point of the inactivation gates, we think, is so that during repolarization, as the potassium ions are shooting out, driving us from positive 30 back towards negative 70. The point of the inactivation gates being closed is so that during repolarization, when you get to negative 55 millivolts, the voltage-gated sodium channels don't just open again, because that's what would happen. You'd be at threshold again, and the voltage-gated sodium channels would open again, and then sodium would start shooting in, and the interior would begin to depolarize. It would begin to become more positive. That wouldn't make any sense. You need the inactivation gates to be the ones that are closed, so the inactivation gates don't open up under a voltage, and that allows for you to get past negative 55 millivolts and keep becoming more negative towards the resting membrane potential. Now, like I said, I think I can explain this best if we pretend that the voltage-gated sodium channels only have activation gates. This would show you what would happen. Okay, so this is a hypothetical neuron that only has voltage-gated sodium channels with activation gates. All right? Let's go through this quickly. We don't need to go through all the specifics of it because you know everything that's going to happen. You go from negative 70 up to negative 55. That's threshold. Then, we'll draw them in green, the activation gates open. Okay. That allows for sodium to shoot in and drive the interior from negative 55 up to positive 30. Well, what happens at positive 30 in this example is just simply the activation gates close. The activation gates shut, and still the voltage-gated potassium channels open, right? Those are the two things that are going to happen at positive 30. Okay? So the activation gates shut, that prevents any more sodium from being able to come in, which is great, right? That would be true. And simultaneously, the voltage-gated potassium channels open. So, oops, wrong color. So potassium shoots out and drives us back down towards resting membrane potential. We are repolarizing back towards resting membrane potential. We're becoming more negative. Okay. Well, if we move from positive 30 back down towards negative 70, and then we get to negative 55 millivolts during that process, the activation gates at negative 55 would open back up because that's their threshold. They open at negative 55. So during repolarization, when the potassium ions are shooting out, you're getting an efflux of potassium ions and the interior is becoming more negative. When you get back to negative 55, the activation gates would pop right back open. And what would happen? Sodium would shoot in, and immediately the hillock would start depolarizing again from negative 55 back towards positive 30. It would be a disaster. It would just be an endless, repetitive loop of action potentials that would never cease. Right? It would just keep happening over and over and over and over again. It would kill the neuron. Okay? You need the neuron to move from positive 30 and get all the way back to negative 70 millivolts without the voltage-gated sodium channels opening again. And that's the purpose of the inactivation gates. Take a look at what actually happens. When threshold is hit, what opens, right? We get from negative 70 to negative 55. Threshold is hit at negative 55. We can put that right there. And the activation gates on the voltage-gated sodium channels pop open. That allows for the sodium ions to shoot in and depolarize the interior from negative 55 to positive 30 millivolts. Okay. At positive 30 millivolts, the interior does not become any more positive. It doesn't depolarize any further. And the explanation as to why mostly is because the voltage-gated sodium channels shut. Specifically, the inactivation gates, which I'll draw in red here, are what close. That prevents any more of these sodium ions from shooting in. So the interior gets stuck at positive 30 millivolts due to a lack or a further influx of sodium ions. Simultaneously, at positive 30 millivolts, the voltage-gated potassium channels open up, and potassium then leaves through both its chemical and its electrical driving force intracellularly to extracellularly, right? So we get a efflux of potassium ions, and since the interior is losing positively charged ions, it's going to begin to become more negative. We call that a repolarization, right? The interior is going to begin to repolarize from positive 30 back towards negative 70 millivolts. Now, in my last example, if there were only activation gates on the voltage-gated sodium channels, then when you get to negative 55 millivolts, the voltage-gated sodium channels here would open again. Right? And then you would just get this endless loop of action potentials, which would be terrible. It would make absolutely no sense. So that doesn't happen. During repolarization from positive 30 millivolts to negative 70 millivolts, The reason that the voltage-gated sodium channels don't open back up at negative 55 millivolts is because what's closed on them are their inactivation gates. The inactivation gates don't open up again under a voltage. So when you get back to negative 55, since the inactivation gates are shut, the voltage-gated sodium channels don't open again. They stay closed, and you can keep repolarizing back towards the resting membrane potential, which is exactly what you need to do. Better said, what the neuron needs to do. This is the relevance of the inactivation gates and why these sodium channels need inactivation gates. So that when you repolarize and get back to the value that is threshold, that the sodium channels don't just open again. They stay shut, and the interior of the axon can continue repolarizing back towards the resting membrane potential. All right. Now, there's another problem with this, and that is if the voltage-gated sodium channels stayed orientated like this, where their inactivation gates were shut, then the voltage-gated sodium channels would never open again, and you would never get another action potential. So something has to happen to reset these voltage-gated sodium channels. And that's going to happen somewhere between right around negative 60 and negative 70 millivolts. This will vary from neuron to neuron, as I'll talk about a little bit later on in the lecture, but somewhere between negative 60 and negative 70, we think that this is mostly a timed process. Somewhere between negative 60 and negative 70, the voltage-gated sodium channels actually reset. What do I mean by that? I'm going to use this image of the voltage-gated sodium channels to discuss this. So when the interior is at positive 30, right, this is how the voltage-gated sodium channel would be orientated, right? Its inactivation gate would be closed if the interior is at positive 30. Simultaneously, where should I draw those? The voltage-gated potassium channels would be open at positive 32, right? And potassium would be shooting out through its chemical and electrical driving force and repolarizing the interior back towards, right, from positive 30 back towards negative 70. Okay. The reason at negative 55 millivolts that the voltage-gated sodium channels don't open again is because the inactivation gates are shut. But somewhere between negative 60 and negative 70 millivolts, the voltage-gated sodium channels reset. What that means is they go back to the original orientation. The inactivation gate pops open, and the activation gate shuts again, right? The voltage-gated sodium channels, and again, we think that this is a timed process, not voltage-related necessarily. Somewhere between negative 60 and negative 70 millivolts, you get a resetting of the voltage-gated sodium channels where the activation gates close and more importantly than anything, the inactivation gates open back up. And what this means now is that if you can get the hillock back to threshold of negative 55 millivolts, then the voltage-gated sodium channels will open again, right? Because you're back to the original orientation at the beginning, where the inactivation gates are open. They're not, really a voltage gate, but that doesn't matter because they're open. And the activation gate is what's closed, and that is a voltage gate. So if you can get the interior back to negative 55 millivolts, which is called threshold, right, then the activation gate will open again, sodium will shoot in, and you'll get another action potential. So let's try to work through this whole process in a similar way that we've been doing. So here is the hillock. If we can get the hillock from negative 70 to negative 55 millivolts, we will hit threshold. At threshold, the voltage-gated sodium channels, specifically their activation gates open up, and that then allows for sodium to shoot in, driving the interior all the way up to positive 30 millivolts. Now, at positive 30 millivolts, two things are going to happen. First of all, the inactivation gates on the voltage-gated sodium channels are going to close, and thus no more sodium is going to be able to enter. Simultaneously, what happens are the voltage-gated potassium channels open. Potassium has a chemical, a diffusion gradient, and electrical driving force to leave because the outside is negative right now because the inside's positive 30. So what does potassium do? It shoots out. And as the potassium ions shoot out, the interior is losing positively charged ions, so the interior is becoming negative. And we also call that, right, repolarizing, right? So it's repolarizing, becoming more negative. It's moving from positive 30 millivolts back down towards negative 70 millivolts. And the important thing is here, as the potassium ions are leaving, making the interior more negative, right, towards the resting membrane potential. When we get to negative 55 millivolts, that's technically threshold, right? We're repolarizing from positive 30 down towards negative 70, and when we hit negative 55, in theory, those voltage-gated sodium channels should open again. But they don't because the voltage-gated sodium channels inactivation gates are closed, which don't open up under a voltage. That's what's so important about those inactivation gates. Right? They ensure that when the axonal regions are repolarizing, that during that repolarization process, when they technically get to the level of threshold, which is negative 55, those inactivation gates ensure that the sodium channels do not open again. They stay closed, right? Because we wouldn't want endless repetitive action potentials. Now, it obviously can't stay like that because then another action potential would never be able to happen if those inactivation gates just stayed permanently shut. So between negative 60 millivolts and negative 70 millivolts, what happens is the voltage-gated sodium channels reset. And let's draw what that would look like. Okay. So those were the potassium channels, but these are the voltage-gated sodium channels. What would happen somewhere between negative 60 and negative 70 is that the sodium channels would reset. What we mean by that is now the activation gates will close, and the inactivation gates will pop back open. And what that also means is once the voltage-gated sodium channels reset, now that the activation gates are the ones that are closed and the inactivation gates are open, if somehow we were to be able to get enough sodium in here to drive the interior back to threshold, these voltage-gated sodium channels would have the capacity to open again and another action potential could be generated. But this is why these inactivation gates are so important. They ensure that during repolarization, that the voltage-gated sodium channels stay shut and at negative 55 at threshold, and another action potential doesn't happen. And then when you repolarize back into the range of negative 60 to negative 70, then the voltage-gated sodium channels reset to their original orientation of open inactivation gates, closed activation gates, and now the sodium channels are completely back to normal, right? If we can get back to threshold, another action potential will happen. But now we also have to discuss the voltage-gated potassium channels. You would think once you get to negative 70 millivolts, right? All that would have to happen is once we get to negative 70 millivolts, if those voltage-gated potassium channels were to shut, now the neuron in the hillock region at least would be completely back to what it was when we first started talking about action potentials, right? There would be no voltage-gated potassium channels open, and the voltage-gated sodium channels would be shut in an orientated way that would allow them to open, with the inactivation gates open and the activation gates shut. The whole hillock region would look exactly like it did when we first started discussing how action potentials happen. We'd be completely back to normal. But unfortunately, that's not exactly what happens. Okay, when we get back to -70, the voltage-gated potassium channels actually don't shut. They actually continue to stay open, and we have to talk about what effect that's going to have. So we have, at this point, repolarized back to -70 millivolts. Okay, so what's going on with the sodium channels? Their inactivation gates are open, their activation gates are shut, green, right? So the sodium channels have completely reset. The potassium channels are open, okay? And again, if they would just shut at -70 millivolts, everything would be back to what we were discussing when we first started talking about action potentials, but that's not actually what happens. These potassium channels here don't close at -70 millivolts. And now we need to think about what effect that's going to have. And in order to explain what effect that's going to have, I need to discuss two different cells, and we need to talk about the resting membrane potential again. So what do we know about cells like neurons? They're at least 25 times more permeable to potassium than they are to sodium. So because they are, these are potassium leak channels, because they're 25 times more permeable to potassium than to sodium, more potassium leaves, then sodium comes in, right? 25 times more leak channels for potassium than leak channels for sodium. So more potassium leaves than sodium comes in. The interior becomes negative due to the loss of positively charged ions. And then when you hit -70 millivolts, the rate at which potassium leaves equals the rate at which sodium comes in. Because at -70, the negative electrical driving force is so strong that it pulls the potassium ions back significantly and the sodium ions insignificantly. And we're to the rate where they come and go at the exact same rate, right? Potassium leaves at the exact same rate that sodium comes in. But now play a little bit of a game here and pretend that we do something a little different. Pretend we have another cell, okay? It has the same concentrations of potassium inside and outside and sodium inside and outside as this one on the top. But instead of for every 25 leak channels for potassium to 1 leak channel for sodium, this one has 30 leak channels for potassium for every 1 sodium leak channel. Basically what I'm saying is this cell is more permeable to potassium than this one. This cell is more permeable to potassium. The cell on the bottom is more permeable to potassium than the cell on the top. It has 30 potassium leak channels for every 1 sodium leak channel. Now you have to think about what would that result in? Okay, let me try to explain this. If you had a stadium and 2 stadiums, each of them had 70,000 people inside, and one stadium had 1,000 doors, and the other stadium had 1,500 doors. Okay. Which stadium would empty faster? Of course, the stadium with 1,500 doors would empty a lot faster than the stadium with 1,000 doors. And that all deals with the rate at which people could leave. If you have 1,500 doors, people are going to be able to leave that stadium faster than if you have another stadium with only 1,000 doors. And that's what's going to happen to these potassium ions. Because there are more leak channels for potassium in this cell than in this cell, meaning there are more leak channels for potassium in the bottom cell than on the top cell, the rate at which potassium can actually leave the bottom cell is greater than the top cell. Remember, for every 1 leak channel for sodium on the top, there's 25 leak channels for potassium. Down here, for every 1 sodium leak channel, there are 30 potassium leak channels. So the rate at which potassium can leave on the bottom is greater than the rate at which potassium can leave on the top. And you can relate that, hopefully, to my stadium example. Okay, so potassium is leaving at a greater rate on the bottom than on the top. And what that ultimately means is this. Now, on the bottom, because the bottom is more permeable to potassium, you actually need a stronger negative electrical driving force on the bottom to be able to pull potassium backwards at the same rate that you pull sodium inward, right? Because potassium can leave at a greater rate on the bottom than on the top. So if you want to pull potassium backwards significantly enough that you simultaneously pull sodium in at the same rate, then you need a more negative resting membrane potential. The cell on the bottom would have a resting, I'm just making something up, but let's say the resting membrane potential would be negative 80 millivolts rather than negative 70. The reason for that is because, again, potassium can leave at a greater rate on the bottom than it can on the top due to the extra channels. So since potassium can leave at a greater rate on the bottom versus the top, you need to make a stronger, the membrane potential needs to get a lot more negative on the inside of the bottom cell in order to be able to pull those potassium ions backwards enough so that it's also pulling the sodium ions inward enough so that they're actually coming and going at the same rate. The way that you would hear this said is the more permeable a cell is to potassium, the closer its resting membrane potential will be to its equilibrium potential. Now, that's a very confusing thing to say unless you really understand what the person is saying. What that means is this. It means the more permeable the cell is to potassium, the greater the rate the potassium ions can leave, and thus the more negative you need to make the interior to be able to pull potassium backwards at the same rate that you could pull sodium inward. Okay? And that's directly applicable to what we need to talk about over here, where at negative 70 millivolts, which is usually the neuron's resting membrane potential, at negative 70 millivolts, these potassium channels stay open. Okay, so I'll draw it again. These are the sodium channels, just to be complete, right? The inactivation gates are open, and the activation gates are shut. The potassium channels, these are the voltage-gated potassium channels, they're open, and they've just allowed us to repolarize to negative 70. But at negative 70 millivolts, they don't actually shut. They stay open. Now, what does that mean? It means in the hillock region, at negative 70 millivolts, the hillock region is a lot more permeable to potassium than it normally is. And that applies to what we just spoke about, right? Because the voltage-gated potassium channels are open. They're still open. And what also can potassium travel through? It can travel through all the leak channels in that membrane as well. So potassium doesn't just have the leak channels that it can normally travel through. It also has these voltage-gated potassium channels that stay open. So right now at negative 70 millivolts, the hillock region is a lot more permeable to potassium than it normally is because it has the leak channels to travel through and it has the voltage-gated potassium channels to travel through. It's like that cell that had 30 potassium leak channels compared to the other cell that only had 25, right? There's extra potassium leak channels open here. So now, because these potassium leak channels are open, and also the voltage-gated potassium channels are open at negative 70, potassium can leave at a greater rate at negative 70 than what it normally can. At negative 70, if you have a whole bunch of extra potassium channels open, these voltage-gated potassium channels open, then potassium will be able to leave at a greater rate than it normally could because there's more channels for it to leave through. Hey, again, just like my stadium example, just like the example that I gave with the cells. So what is that going to mean? If potassium can leave at a greater rate than it normally can at negative 70 because these voltage-gated potassium channels stay open, then at negative 70, more potassium is still going to be leaving than sodium is going to be entering through its leak channels. And what is the hillock region going to begin to do? It's going to begin to do what we call a hyperpolarization. It's going to hyperpolarize. It's actually going to begin to become more negative than what its typical resting membrane potential is. Because potassium is still going to be leaving at a greater rate than sodium's coming in. So the interior is losing more positively charged ions than it's gaining. And thus, it's still going to be becoming more negative because it's continuing to lose more positively charged ions than it's gaining. It's going to keep becoming more negative, and it's actually going to go all the way down to around negative 75 millivolts before it finally stops. This is called a hyperpolarization. The Hillock region, and this is going to happen in every axonal region, hyperpolarizes during repolarization. It doesn't just it doesn't just repolarize back to the resting membrane potential. It actually repolarizes beyond the resting membrane potential, something we call a hyperpolarization. Right? And the reason for that is because the voltage-gated potassium channels stay open at negative 70 millivolts rather than close, creating a transient circumstance of greater potassium permeability, allowing potassium to continue to leave at a greater rate than normal. So then finally, why do we get stuck at negative 75? That is finally at negative 75 millivolts. Right? I'm going to do what I always have done. These are the sodium voltage-gated sodium channels with their inactivation gates open in red and their activation gates shut in green. And here are the, oops, I want to do that in a different color. Here are the voltage-gated potassium channels. Okay, at negative 75 millivolts, the reason that we don't get even more negative than that is because at negative 75 millivolts, finally, those voltage-gated potassium channels shut. They finally close. And now, potassium doesn't have these extra channels to travel through, right? The permeability has now returned for potassium to what it normally is when just the leak channels are there, right? There's still all those potassium leak channels, but the extra potassium channels, the voltage-gated potassium channels that were open, they're now gone at negative 75. So the rate at which potassium can leave once you get to negative 75 and the voltage-gated potassium channels shut slows down, right? Because you're closing doors for potassium to leave through. Again, imagine you have a stadium. There's 1,500 doors in the stadium for people to leave through, and then you shut 250 of them. Right now, there's only 1,250 doors. All of a sudden, the rate at which those people can leave is less. That's what happens here, because at negative 75, these voltage-gated potassium channels shut finally, and now that extra permeability that was there for potassium is gone all of a sudden. So the rate at which potassium can leave slows, is reduced, and you get stuck at negative 75. Now here's the next thing that you have to take into consideration. Since the voltage-gated potassium channels closed, and you've returned to the standard permeability in terms of 25 potassium leak channels for every 1 sodium leak channel, we have to think about what that means. There's 2 reasons in reality why once the voltage-gated potassium channels close, that potassium can leave at a lesser rate. Okay, one, just the closing of those potassium channels decreases the potassium permeability of the hillock, and thus there's less doors for potassium to leave through, so the rate at which potassium is going to leave is going to slow down, because now all it has is the leak channels to leave through. But secondly, look at this. The interior is now negative 75, which is 5 millivolts more negative than what the resting membrane potential is. So because of the fact that the interior is negative 75 rather than negative 70, right, it's hyperpolarized in the hillock, that's actually going to be pulling the potassium ions back to an even greater degree than normal, right? That's a stronger negative electrical driving force. So both of these are factors as to why potassium is actually now going to be leaving at a lesser rate. Now you have to think about sodium. Sodium has those leak channels it can travel through. And what has happened here, right? We've hyperpolarized. So the interior is actually negative 75, which is 5 millivolts more negative than the resting membrane potential at the standard permeability of 25:1, right? Well, now that the voltage-gated potassium channels have closed, right, we've returned to the standard permeability. So the rate at which potassium can leave is reduced. There's less channels for it to travel through. The interior is now even more negative than the resting membrane potential, so it's pulling the potassium ions backwards even more strongly. And What about the sodium ions? Because the interior is negative 75, the sodium ions are actually going to be being pulled in at a greater rate than they would be at the resting membrane potential, right? There's a stronger negative electrical driving force inside of the hillock region right now than is typically there during the resting membrane potential of negative 70. So the rate at which sodium can enter right now at negative 75 is actually greater than the rate at which potassium can leave. Again, you've removed all those extra channels, voltage-gated potassium channels that potassium can leave through, and the interior now now that you're back to the standard permeability of 25:1 is actually more negative than the resting membrane potential, and that's going to pull potassium backwards at a greater rate than it would at the resting membrane potential, and sodium inward at a greater rate than it would at the resting membrane potential. And what does that mean? Again, because of this, sodium is actually going to be entering into the hillock region at a greater rate than potassium will be leaving. Well, if more sodium is entering into the hillock region than potassium is leaving, then the hillock region is gaining more positively charged sodium ions than it's losing in positively charged potassium ions. So what's going to begin to happen? The interior is going to begin to depolarize. It's actually going to begin to become more positive until it hits negative 70 millivolts. It's actually going to rise from negative 75 to negative 70 until it gets back to the true resting membrane potential, right? The reason that it begins to depolarize here, become more positive, is because at negative 75, that's a strong enough negative electrical driving force that actually more sodium is entering than potassium is leaving, and thus it begins to depolarize, make the interior more positive. There's a gain of positively charged ions. Now, why at negative 75 do we finally get back to a resting circumstance? Once we get back to negative 75, that's finally when we actually have returned to the true original orientation of everything that we were discussing when we first started talking about action potentials. The reason that you truly and finally get stuck at negative 70 here is because once you get back to negative 70, the interior has become a little bit more positive. And since the interior is a little bit more positive, that's going to slow down the rate to a small degree of how much sodium can enter, right? Because there's less of a negative electrical driving force at negative 70 than there would be at negative 75. So the rate at which sodium is being pulled in will decrease slightly, and the rate at which potassium is being pulled back will decrease slightly, right? Because if the interior is negative 70 versus negative 75, at negative 70, that's less of a negative electrical driving force. So potassium won't be being pulled back as strongly, and it'll begin to exit at a greater rate again. And at negative 70, you'll be back to the true resting membrane potential, where just as much potassium is leaving as sodium is entering. And now you've truly returned to the resting membrane potential, and the whole entire axon hillock is reset to its original orientation that we were discussing at the beginning. And now you have enough information to make sense of the entire action potential graph. Okay. You have to imagine what this action potential graph is showing. It's showing the membrane potential of the hillock. Okay. So it normally rests at negative 70 millivolts, which is right here. Okay. And then if a whole bunch of sodium ions from the dendritic regions head into the hillock, right? These are electrical impulses coming from the dendritic regions into the hillock. It can make the hillock more positive. And if the hillock gets up to negative 55 millivolts, then what's going to happen? Right? We'll do this in red. How about? Then we're going to hit threshold. That's what this is depicted right here, right? Threshold of negative 55. What happens at threshold? Well, the voltage-gated sodium channels, specifically, their activation gates open. And when their activation gates open, sodium rushes in, and it drives the interior up to positive 30 millivolts, right? That's what's being depicted right here. We drive the interior up to positive 30 millivolts. And then, for some reason, we get stuck at positive 30 millivolts. How could that be? Well, we get stuck at positive 30 millivolts for two reasons. the inactivation gates on the voltage-gated sodium channels shut. That prevents any more sodium from being able to come in. Simultaneously, what happens are the voltage-gated potassium channels open up. And what happens here, right? Potassium's higher on the inside than it is on the outside. So it has a chemical driving force to leave. Right now, the inside is positive and the outside is slightly negative, right? So it also has an electrical driving force to leave, and that's exactly what happens. Potassium shoots out through its chemical and electrical driving force, and that repolarizes the hillock, right? So that's what you're seeing here. You're seeing after positive 30, you're seeing repolarization of this axonal region. Now, as we're repolarizing and we get back to negative 55 millivolts, why don't the voltage-gated sodium channels open again? And the reason that the voltage-gated sodium channels don't open again at negative 55 is because their inactivation gates are what are closed. And their inactivation gates don't open up under a voltage. So when we get back to negative 55, another action potential doesn't happen. The voltage-gated sodium channels don't open. That's very important. Now, somewhere between like negative 60 and negative 70, what will finally happen is the voltage-gated sodium channels will reset. Now we'll just do it like that. Okay. What does that actually mean? It means their inactivation gates pop open and their activation gates will shut, right? Somewhere between negative 60 and negative 70. Great. So if we can get back to threshold, again, this happens somewhere between negative 60 and negative 70. So if somehow we could get back to threshold, another action potential will happen. But that's not what we're discussing right now. Okay, resetting. The voltage-gated sodium channels reset. And then when we get back to negative 70, right, you would think that's when the voltage-gated potassium channels would shut and everything would be normal, but that doesn't happen. The voltage-gated potassium channels at negative 70 actually stay open. And that creates an increased potassium permeability. And the potassium ions continue to shoot out at a greater rate than sodium enters at negative 70. And that's due to that increased permeability to potassium due to the open voltage-gated potassium channels. And because more potassium is leaving than sodium is coming in, it actually causes a hyperpolarization. It drives us all the way down to like negative 75. And then finally at negative 75, what happens? The voltage-gated potassium channels finally shut, right? So that extra potassium that was leaving loses its ability to leave. The rate at which potassium leaves at negative 75 slows down because the voltage-gated potassium channels close. You've returned now to the standard permeability of potassium, meaning 25 potassium leak channels for every 1 sodium leak channel. So now the rate at which potassium can leave decreases for 2 reasons, right? The extra potassium channels are closed, and also the interior, we've returned to the standard permeability, and now the interior is actually more negative than it is at the regular resting membrane potential. So potassium is actually being pulled back at a greater rate than sodium is being pulled into the cell, right? Sodium is being pulled into the cell at a greater rate, and potassium is being pulled back into the cell at a greater rate. So what you end up here with is more potassium entering into the hillock region than potassium leaving. Right? Let me make sure I said that right. Right, when the interior is at negative 75 millivolts, you have such a strong negative electrical driving force that potassium is being pulled back significantly and sodium is being pulled in significantly, greater than at the resting membrane potential. So that actually results in more sodium entering into the hillock than potassium leaving. So that causes then a slight depolarization because the cell is gaining more positively charged ions than it's losing, gaining more sodium than it's losing in potassium. And that drives us then back up to the true resting membrane potential. And at negative 70 millivolts, once we get back to negative 70 millivolts, the drive for sodium to come in will have decreased slightly, and the drive for potassium to come back will have decreased slightly. So finally, potassium will actually leave at the same rate that sodium comes in, and we have truly now returned back to where we started. That is what these graphs show you. When you see these in the future, and you will many times throughout your life if you continue to study physiology and medicine, that's what's actually being depicted. This whole process is being depicted in this graph. And that actually happens in every single region of the axon, because every single region hits positive 30, and then every single region has to repolarize back ultimately to negative 70 for another action potential to occur. Now that we have gone through all of this, it makes understanding refractory periods very easy. So refractory periods deal with when another action potential can be generated within the hillock. First of all, there's what's called the absolute refractory period. The absolute refractory period just means the period of time where under no circumstance whatsoever another action potential can be generated. Okay, it's everything highlighted in yellow here is the absolute refractory period. Let me explain. Between negative 55 threshold and positive 30, of course, another action potential can't be generated in the hillock because one is happening. Right? If an action potential is happening in the hillock, how's another action potential going to occur? It makes absolutely no sense. Okay, so that part's easy. But then the second part's slightly more tricky, but also really not bad either. During repolarization, from positive 30 all the way between negative 60 and negative 70, that also is the absolute refractory period. During that period of repolarization from positive 30 to somewhere between negative 60 and negative 70, another action potential also can't happen. And the reason for that is because the voltage-gated sodium channels inactivation gates are closed. Those inactivation gates can't open up under a voltage. So what happens at positive 30, right? The voltage-gated sodium channels inactivation gates close, and no more sodium can come in. Okay? And those inactivation gates stay closed until the voltage-gated sodium channels reset somewhere between negative 60 and negative 70 during repolarization. And as long as those inactivation gates are closed, those voltage-gated sodium channels are never opening again, and you're never getting another action potential. So the point is, the absolute refractory period lasts from the time that you hit threshold at negative 55 to the time that the hillock repolarizes to between negative 60 and negative 70, and the voltage-gated sodium channels reset. Once the voltage-gated sodium channels have reset, and the inactivation gate has popped open and the activation has closed, then if you get to threshold, another action potential can happen. But until that point of the voltage-gated sodium channels resetting, around negative 60 to negative 70, you're not getting another action potential, and that is part of the absolute refractory period. Then we have something else, which is highlighted in this more like reddish color, which is the relative refractory period. The relative refractory period is the period of time in which another action potential can be generated, but it's a lot harder than normal. Okay, why? Why during the relative refractory period is it harder than normal? Okay, so I really divide the relative refractory period into two parts. Okay, the first part of the relative refractory period happens from the time that the voltage-gated sodium channels reset somewhere between negative 60 and negative 70 until you hit the peak hyperpolarization of like around negative 75, okay, which would be like right here. Okay, so the first half of the relative refractory period is again from the time that the voltage-gated sodium channels reset until negative 75. That period of time, another action potential could occur if you could get the hillock region up to negative 55 millivolts, meaning if you could get enough sodium ions into the hillock to drive the hillock up to negative 55 millivolts, then another action potential could happen. The voltage-gated sodium channels would absolutely open. Okay? But it's a lot harder to do that than normal. Why? Because the hillock is actively hyperpolarizing, right? The hillock is actively becoming more negative. right, than the resting membrane potential. You have a whole bunch of voltage-gated potassium channels open. Potassium is still shooting out, making the interior more negative. And to get back to threshold, you would have to overcome the fact that the interior of the hillock is actually becoming more negative actively. That's a lot harder to get to threshold than under a normal circumstance where the hillock is just resting, right, at negative 70 millivolts. If you get enough sodium into the hillock region, right, to drive it up to negative 55, then you would get to threshold under a normal circumstance. But during the relative refractory period, from the period of time that the voltage-gated sodium channels reset to the, and this is the first half of the relative refractory period, to the period of time where we hit peak negativity of negative 75 millivolts, peak hyperpolarization, right? Getting to threshold during this period of time is a lot harder than under a normal circumstance, because you'd have to overcome the fact that a whole bunch of extra potassium ions are actively shooting out of the hillock region, making it more negative. What you would have to do is you'd have to get a whole lot more sodium ions into the hillock region than normal to actually drive the hillock region up to negative 55 millivolts or to threshold. That is the first half of what I'd call the relative refractory period. Now let's talk about the second half. The second half of the relative refractory period is from peak hyperpolarization, peak negativity of negative 75, until we return back to the standard resting membrane potential of negative 70. That would be the second half of the relative refractory period. The relative refractory period, by definition, is the period of time where another action potential could be generated in the hillock, but it's a lot harder than normal. This is what I would call the second half. Oftentimes people will just lump all of it together as the relative refractory period, but there's really two different reasons why the relative refractory period happens. You know, there's a first half and a second half. During the second half, it's just harder to get the hillock region to threshold, right? Because you're at like negative 75 or negative 73 millivolts, right? And that's more negative than the standard negative 70 millivolts. So think about this. To get the hillock region to threshold during the second half of the relative refractory period, what do you have to do? You need to, let's just say from negative 75. To get the hillock region to threshold during the second half of the relative refractory period, you would have to drive the hillock region up by 20 millivolts. Under a normal circumstance, right, you would only need to drive the hillock region up by 15 millivolts. Right? During the second half of the relative refractory period, assuming that we're at negative 75, you would have to get enough sodium ions into the hillock region to drive the interior up by 20 millivolts, from negative 75 to negative 55. During a normal circumstance, you would only need to get enough sodium ions into the hillock region to drive the interior up 15 millivolts, negative 70 to negative 55. So thus, it's harder during the second half of the relative refractory period to generate another action potential, because you need to depolarize the hillock to a greater degree than you typically do, right? You need to depolarize the hillock by 20 millivolts rather than by 15 millivolts, and that requires more sodium ions, more electrical impulses from the dendritic region than what would typically be required. No matter how you look at it, during the relative refractory period, another action potential can be generated, meaning if you can get back to negative 55 millivolts, the voltage-gated sodium channels activation gates will open. Right? During the relative refractory period, another action potential can be generated, completely opposite from the absolute, where under no circumstance can one be generated. But also, during the relative refractory period, it's much harder to actually get to threshold and generate an action potential compared to normal circumstances. Another action potential can be generated, but it's harder than normal because it's harder to get to threshold during the relative refractory period than under a normal circumstance. All right, I've spoken enough. So there's a couple more things on the exam that I'm essentially just going to give you the answer to right now if you just pay attention, rather than going into much detail, because I've already, I think, worn out my welcome with how much I've spoken in this lecture. So I've already said what a graded potential is. A graded potential is any electrical impulse that decrements. The electrical impulses that travel from the dendritic regions towards the hillock are graded potentials because they decrement as they move away from the site of origin. Compared to action potentials, which don't decrement, right? They're non-decremental. They stay at positive 30 millivolts down the entire length of the axon. To get into much more detail about this in future lectures about why this is the case, but what happens is typically if this is the presynaptic neuron in green here and this is the postsynaptic neuron in yellow here, if the presynaptic neuron only fires one time, meaning passes only one action potential to the postsynaptic neuron won't actually generate an action potential. Basically, the graded potential, the electrical impulse, doesn't allow for enough sodium ions to get into the hillock to actually drive the hillock up by 15 millivolts. So to resolve that problem, what the presynaptic neuron has to do is it actually has to fire multiple times over a short period of time. We measure this in seconds. We call it hertz. So the presynaptic neuron might have to fire 10 times over the course of a second in order to actually generate enough graded potentials, meaning allow for enough sodium ions, electrical impulses, to get into the hillock region to drive it up to threshold. Again, the reason for this is because the electrical impulses, they decrement as they move away from the point of origin. So if the presynaptic neuron only fires, one time, that electrical impulse is going to decrement so much by the time that it gets to the hillock that it won't get the hillock to threshold. But if that presynaptic neuron can fire many, many times over a short period of time, it'll allow enough sodium to get into the dendritic regions to actually reach the hillock and drive it to threshold. This process by one neuron increasing its firing frequency to get another neuron to threshold is called temporal summation. Additionally, if multiple neurons are actually working together to get another neuron to threshold, meaning like two presynaptic neurons here in in green, working on one postsynaptic neuron here in yellow, then we call this spatial summation. It's where multiple neurons, presynaptic neurons, are actually working together, both releasing excitatory neurotransmitters and causing graded potentials to get another neuron to threshold. So if you think about this, like maybe over here, this one presynaptic neuron in green might have to fire 10 times a second to allow enough sodium into the postsynaptic neuron to actually cause the hillock region to get to threshold. Okay, if presynaptic neuron number one there could fire 10 times over the course of a second, then the postsynaptic neuron will actually generate an action potential. We'd call that temporal summation. But over here, what would each one of these have to do over the course of a second? They each only have to fire 5 times per second if they're working together to allow the postsynaptic neuron to get to threshold. So if it's two neurons working together, we refer to that as spatial summation. If two neurons are working together, if two presynaptic neurons are working together to get a postsynaptic neuron to threshold, it's spatial summation. If one neuron is entirely working by itself, one presynaptic neuron totally working by itself to get a postsynaptic neuron to threshold, it's called temporal summation. Exam about this, and I'm just giving you the answer. There is either going to be a question about temporal or spatial summation. If it's temporal summation, it's one neuron working by itself to get another neuron to threshold by increasing its firing frequency. Here you can see this one neuron firing multiple times over the course of a second to actually allow the postsynaptic neuron's hillock region to get to threshold. If it's spatial summation, then it's multiple presynaptic neurons, different presynaptic neurons working together, right? So that's what's showing. Presynaptic neuron W, presynaptic neuron X, working together, both releasing excitatory neurotransmitters. They're working together to get the postsynaptic neurons hillock region to threshold. All that you got to know for the exam is temporal summation, one neuron working by itself, increasing its firing frequency to get a postsynaptic neuron to threshold. Spatial summation, multiple different neurons working together to get a postsynaptic neuron to threshold. I'm also just going to give you the answer as to how myelin sheath works, how it allows for axons to propagate faster action potentials. I'm going to explain all of this in a future lecture coming right up in the third module, but for now there's going to be a question on the exam that says, What's the function of myelin sheath? What's its major role? Its major role is to prevent potassium ions from leaking out. That's the answer. Circle it. You're going to get it right. I'll explain it later on in the next module. It's just a free answer for now. It prevents potassium ions from leaking out. To allow neurons to propagate fast action potentials, there's actually two things that you can do. You can myelinate the axon for one thing, and you can also increase the diameter of the axon as well. Okay. Larger diameter also results in a faster action potential propagation. The speed at which the action potential can move down the axon, you can increase that by myelinating the axon or by increasing its diameter, or in best case scenario, actually doing both. And as I said, in the coming lectures, I'll explain all of this.